going to begin this morning with a reading. The reading is called The Butterfly Effect, and this was written by Dana Capasso. The delicate flapping wings of a butterfly have the power to set molecules of air in motion, in turn moving more molecules of air. A tiny act that is eventually capable of affecting weather patterns on the other side of the planet. Now, this notion comes from a concept within chaos theory called the butterfly effect. Simply, this effect refers to a phenomenon in our world in which a small change in one place can result in equal or greater changes elsewhere. Now, this may seem crazy, a tiny butterfly changing global weather patterns. Not only is the butterfly effect a real scientific theory, but it's also an intriguing philosophical idea. I say all this because the butterfly effect affects the way I live my life and the decisions that I make in a way that no ideas about God ever have. I'm no meteorologist, nor am I well-versed in entomology. But ever since learning about the butterfly effect, I have been attracted to it because it demonstrates an important principle that is often forgotten. Namely, each of our actions has effects that are more profound than we think. Interconnection is a major theme found in nearly all the world's religions and philosophical traditions. The interconnectedness of our universe is also one of the most significant revelations of physics. All components of matter are interconnected, interrelated, and interdependent. As Unitarian Universalists, we affirm and promote our responsibility to remain aware of interconnection through our seventh principle, respect for the interdependent web of all existence. Attention to interconnectivity reminds me, despite the many socio-political forces that work to divide us from one another, that I'm never alone in this world. It reminds me that each decision or action I make has reactions, and that those reactions reverberate as waves moving back and forth across our globe. This compels me to live my life aware of the consequences of my daily actions. From the purchases I make to personal interactions with others, I certainly do not always succeed, but I try. My awareness of interconnectivity and efforts to work against the illusion of division remain my most significant spiritual practice. This spiritual practice also gives me the ability to stand in awe of interconnection, in awe of the butterfly effect, and the power that comes with it. On rare occasions, I'm reminded to stop and appreciate the divinity of interconnectivity revealed before my very own eyes. To me, this is awe-inspiring. This to me is divine. That's the end of the reading. So, our seventh principle, the last principle for the moment, I think we're going to have an eighth principle pretty soon. So our seventh and now last principle is we affirm and promote respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. And I think if you asked most UUs what this principle is all about, I think most would say, well, it's about the nature and the environment. And that's correct. Yet the seventh principle, its concept of interdependence and the interdependent web really go further beyond. They go well beyond what we think of as nature and the environment. There's a minister out there named Reverend Forrest Gilmore. He says, the seventh principle is our response to the great dangers of both individualism and oppression. It is our solution to the seeming conflict between the individual and the group, right? The answer is individual group? No, the answer is interdependence, right? There's a famous psychologist who said, one cannot lead a life that is truly excellent without feeling that one belongs to something greater and more permanent than oneself. This is one conclusion that is common to all the various religions that gives meaning to people's lives. Reverend Gilmore goes on to say that UUism is no exception. Our faith has been wise to reject the rigidity of fundamentalism and to stand against false understandings of the holy. Yet in our zeal for rejecting conservative theologies, we fail to be equally wary of the harms of individualism. In our struggle for freedom, we may have given up on something vitally important to our lives, a dedication to something greater than ourselves alone. So, concerned about this rampant individualism he saw, in 1998, a sociologist named Robert Bellah, he gave an address to the UUA General Assembly. He challenged the Unitarian Universalists to give up our individualism and make respect for the interdependent web of all existence the first of our principles, not our last. I have to say, they're not ranked in order of importance, but he's just saying, for emphasis, it should be first. And this Reverend Gilmore agrees. He says the seventh principle is nothing less than a statement on the divine, right? To him, this is a statement of divinity, right? So important. And in that statement lies the profound hope for the healing of our world, right? He sees potential and interconnection for healing of the world. He prays that we transform our UU sanctuaries of individualism into communities of awe and purpose, and agrees that we should make the interdependent web our first principle and not the last, and do so not just in words, but in everything we do. So talking about interdependence up there before anything else. And it's safe to say that the seventh principle is one of our most important and most compelling principles. And it's also one of the two people tend to remember. People remember the first and the seventh, and the ones in between get a little fuzzy. We can remember keywords, but they're not poetry. They're really hard to memorize, I know. But the first and the seventh are the most memorable. But yet, Unitarian Universalism survived for its first 21 years after the consolidation of the Unitarians and the Universalists. It survived 21 years with only 6 principles. The seventh principle was not adopted until the General Assembly in June 1984. And it was a little bit unexpected, not that there would be a seventh principle, but exactly how it would be worded. Things really started to happen at that General Assembly when the Reverend Paul LaRue took the microphone. Now, he was described as lanky and bearded with the ease of an experienced minister. He came up in front of the Grand Assembly. He looked around, briefly stroked his beard, as I guess men with beards tend to do, and then thoughtful men with beards, apparently. But then he addressed this proposed seventh principle, because at the time, as it was proposed, it read like this: respect for the earth and the interdependence of its living systems. Okay, that was the draft form. Respect for the earth and the interdependence of its living systems. But Reverend LaRue, he pointed out how that wording really fell short of all it could be. So he proposed new wording for the seventh principle. I feel like the colors behind me are shifting and the lights are like going wonky, but I don't know what y'all see, but my paper is changing colors. It's interesting. So he felt a lack in this seventh principle, so he proposed new wording. He proposed this call to respect the interdependent web of existence of which we are all a part. And that new wording hit a real chord with the General Assembly. And this is an unusual thing, because usually the General Assembly is not really all about making last-minute changes. It's about making last-minute changes, but they're very rarely agreed upon, right? But everybody bought in almost instantaneously. It's almost like something felt inherently correct about this seventh principle. So his suggested wording was adopted. So this shows that even as originally intended, the seventh principle has ended up not just being about ecosystems. It tells us in a pretty straightforward way that we are part of an interdependent whole. We as human beings, we are part of this. We are not apart from it, but we are part of it. You might say that, this interconnectedness, it provides a force that kind of moderates our individual nature. Right? It draws us into connection with one another, with all living systems, with all that is greater. I think our seventh principle is really an insurance policy against believing it's all about me and my own individual needs, right? It's our constant reminder. I'm not at the center of this. We're all in this together. So you might not find it surprising that the Reverend Paul Heroux, who's still a Unitarian Universalist minister but retired, he shaped our seventh principle. And as you might guess, he had a really strong earth-centered spirituality. He said he spent a lot of time, he just didn't come up with this wording on the spur of the moment. He spent a lot of time contemplating and reflecting theologically on his proposed rewording long before General Assembly. And he's written about what influenced him to come up with this wording. He was a student of something called deep ecology. It's a philosophy that values all living beings, regardless of their relative value or benefit to us, or their perceived level of higher or lower consciousness. So this makes me suppose that Reverend Paul Heroux sees value in cockroaches, right? That's a stretch for me, but according to deep ecology, cockroaches are in. They're, yay, cockroaches. He was also influenced by a feminist theology, and I'm not talking about theology, Theology. This is theology, Theaolog, so thea as opposed to theo. He said he was affected by its emphasis on human interdependence, mutual caring, the sacredness of interrelationship, and the idea that morals and ethics are not abstractions, right? They're actions. He learned that it's women who often base their moral and ethical decisions on the living structure of interdependent human relationships. He began to see the world as made up of more than what we call living systems, that we also must take into account the non-living, all right? Non-living things. All that is gaseous, liquid, or solid, or perhaps in transition from one to the other. We may think of a sandy beach as non-living, but it's an important part of an ecosystem upon which living things depend. So the sand itself is not living, but it is part of the interdependent whole. So everything in the universe, everything, living or not, is in interdependent relationship. So, a reference to Earth and living systems. This reference, Earth and living systems, in the beginning draft of the seventh principle, became an interdependent web. And that we are in the web also became very explicit. Earth and living systems could no longer be mistaken for things outside of us, right? Or things that we may have, in a traditional Christian point of view, dominion over. It's us and this dominion, right? We are in the web. Because really nothing is outside the interdependent web. Nothing, not a thing. Even if you can think of one, you're probably wrong. Nothing is outside the interdependent web. So the influences of earth-centered religions that include all sorts of indigenous traditions around the globe, such as those of Native Americans, and then our neo-pagans and Druids, and many others, can also be seen. This philosophy can be seen in our seventh principle, because interconnectedness is one of the most essential central concepts of these religions. And for the Western mindset, of which is our dominant culture here in the US, emphasis on interconnectedness and interdependence, it's really countercultural to the culture in which we are raised if we're raised in the Western mind, in the Western world. Right, but there are places where that culture of interconnectedness is natural, is baked into consciousness. Again, the Native American sense of interdependence. Here in North America, it was suppressed and nearly extinguished a long time ago. While those of the Western mindset see themselves as being independent of their social environment, right? There's me and my environment around me. Not just Native Americans, but East Asian societies, right? Their whole self-concept is based in relationship with others, in interdependence. So that's why you hear a lot more about interdependence in Eastern religion and indigenous religion. For Native Americans, it's all about being in a sacred relationship to the land, to the community, and to the spirit world. Native American people cite an interdependent relationship to all natural phenomena, which drives their protection of sacred sites and living sustainably and in harmony with the environment, something I think we, should learn from. In Buddhism, back to the Eastern traditions, you hear a lot about interbeing. That's another way of stating interdependence. Every person, place, and thing is seen as entirely dependent on other people and other things. And necessary, right? As a necessary condition for existence, because we are not going to survive without our interdependence. You know, we are alive because we have food to eat, and you know all the things that have to happen in order for us to have the food for us to eat, right? Deep interdependence. You know, the sun shines on the earth, the clouds bring rain, the crops grow. Someone tends to the crops, harvests them, someone else brings them to market, and yet another person makes a meal from them that we can eat, if it's not ourselves making the meal. You know, each time this process is repeated, just the simple process of eating, the interdependence of our lives links us with more and more people, with more and more rays of sun and drops of rain. So ultimately, there's nothing and no one with whom we are not connected. Interdependence, or interbeing as it's often stated, is seen as the nature of reality. That is reality. The reality is not me versus them. The reality is we. We are all linked. We all affect each other. Even Taoist philosophy was influenced by observations of nature that took it to a place of interdependence. You know, Taoist philosophers determined that everything has a complementary opposite and can only be understood by comparing it to its opposite. Day is only day in relation to night, cold is only cold in relation to heat, soft is only soft in relation to hard. And these relationships are always kind of in a constant state of flux. Day goes to night, night goes to day. So then all things are dependent on one another. And although you might not hear it as often, there are Christian concepts of interdependence. Dr. King, I think this quote, at least part of it, is actually in our hymnal. He said, "In a real sense, all life is interrelated. All men are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be, and you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be." This is the interrelated structure of reality. That's what he said. And of course, he was using this concept of interdependence to make his case for justice, right? So I think Dr. King, I don't know if he'd ever heard of it or if it was invented then, but I think he had some kind of inherent understanding of the butterfly effect and how it relates to justice. There's an author named Madeline Lango. She wrote the popular children's book, Wrinkle in Time. She was, I'm not sure if she's still with us or not, but she's an Episcopalian, a religious, liberal Episcopalian, and her novels are infused with spirituality, and religious liberals liked it, and religious conservatives didn't. But in her writing, she had a sense of interdependence, which coexisted perfectly with her theistic religion. She said, "The stars are often referred to in Genesis. God took Abraham out into the desert night to show him the stars and to make incredible promises. How glorious those stars must have been all those centuries ago when the planet was not circled by a corona of light from all our cities, by smog from our internal combustion engines." She continues, "Jacob, lying on the ground, the stone under his head would have seen stars as we cannot see them today. If we look at the makeup of the word disaster, dis-aster, we see dis, which means separation, and aster, which means star. So disaster is separation from the stars. Such separation is disaster indeed. When we are separated from the stars, from the sea, from each other, we are in danger of being separated from God." So it seems like everywhere you look, you can find references to interdependence. Yet somehow, our world and its people still suffer and are still in danger. I suppose, we simply haven't gotten it yet. Or if we get it, have gotten it, we haven't acted on it nearly enough. Our seventh principle, it's not only spiritually rich and theologically deep, it's also a practical imperative, right? It's something to act on. And I'm afraid to say, with climate change, our seventh principle is become a life or death kind of thing. The inability of humankind to truly understand its interdependence, it's putting both the planet and its people at risk of death and destruction, of disaster. So I think what we need here, much easier said than done, is a global ethic, a new global ethic of a new global consciousness of interdependence, right? Way overdue, wouldn't you agree? So at the end of the day, I see us all as big butterflies. There's every wing beat has an impact. May we live our lives aware of the consequences of our daily actions. May this awareness become a spiritual practice, helping us to work against this illusion that we've been taught of division. It's not real. May we stand in awe of the butterfly effect and the power that comes with it. May we use our wing beats to heal rather than to harm, to love rather than to hate, and to unite rather than to divide. Amen, and blessed be.